Oh, the recording. I was just curious. In California, we recently pushed back the most recent effort to stop what would be our cap and trade program, and we were part of a group that would include some of the western provinces. Curious what, if anything, you're hearing whether or not Canada is going to back off from that, likely to continue to move forward, or how that might be moving along.
Well, so, be careful with my words. The Western Climate Initiative is something that the government of Canada, the federal government, is not formally involved in. It's within Canada, it's a provincial-led initiative, 4 provinces, 7 U.S. states. Although the U.S. states, as you know, are at various stages of whether they are going to, how quickly they will follow along and implement and follow along with California. I'm not. I know that some of our provinces, Ontario, for example, has just been consulting on a reporting rule that would facilitate becoming part of a Western Climate Initiative, cap and trade system. BC has taken a number of steps. So I have not heard any of the provinces say that they are backing away from it yet. But it's, we obviously don't speak for them. So just as my personal view is, I haven't heard that they are not proceeding. Obviously, I have a lot of friends in that community, and everyone was watching the referendum on Assembly Bill 32 very carefully, and I think the people who are pro-cap and trade were quite pleased with the results of that. And so how quickly it proceeds in Canada to state and province-driven initiatives will be an interesting thing for us all to watch in the years to come.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question of Luis. I understand that there are 2 or 3 Mexican states that have at least observer status in the Western Climate Initiative.
Yes, that's right.
And do you think that they might be looking for a more active role?
Yes, for sure. The thing is that we still have a lot to do in establishing what specific activities can we do in the states. Because it's kind of easy to determine the problems, but how are you going to address those? It's another issue. And doing that, being local, being local in the terms of, yeah, we want to do this because this is what our local people is wanting us to do, or what we should do, considering where are we located. That's much more difficult. I've been looking at some of this works by the states, and most of these local governments, and they do a lot in trying to get information in years to come, and then obtain the money for that information and money for the guys that will develop that information. But then going to real activities, then it trickles down to really very little proposals.
Yeah. Yes.
My name is Esther Aranda. I'm with URS, a consulting firm, engineering and planning. And I have a question for Luis. How open is the Mexican government, or semi-not, to adopting your approach? The approach you just described in terms of participatory development of, solutions.
Well, they are. Actually, there was just a project that we finalized in 2009, and now we're working on the guidelines, and they are open to new guidelines. Actually, we are convincing some huge promoters of to ports in the same place in Baja California to go with this new proposal of guidelines. And now that the government guys know that they are not, just putting a gun in their heads, they are more sympathetic with the idea of being able to analyze, much more than what the law is saying. But it's been difficult. It's been 4 years of convincing. But we're doing much better in that, and I think that will help the EA regulations, which are still have been there waiting to be passed for now 5 years.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Carl Lane from Health Canada. Question for Dean. One of the problems you've indicated in some of the decisions we have on significance is that project is too small, you know, so the impacts of climate change are negligible. How seriously would you consider regional EAs as one possible solution to get over this piecemeal approach to small local projects? I'm thinking perhaps particularly for tar sands projects.
Thanks. I remind you that in the federal government we call them oil sands. How serious? Okay, so that's an interesting question. I indicated I'm fairly new to this area, but one of the, being responsible for policy analysis and thinking about some of the forward-looking policy issues in EA at the agency, certainly one of the areas that we're very interested in thinking about is regional SEA and what it can contribute. We've done some work on that front. We had some, we even presented some of that to the federal, provincial, Canadian councils and ministers of the environment met about a year ago and sort of accepted a report examining what role RSEA could contribute. Climate change and cumulative effects are obviously something where that I think could play a big role. There's a very interesting process underway right now for those who don't, again, intimately follow what happens north of the border in the province of Alberta, where most of the oil sands are located. And they've brought in at the provincial level, I can't remember the name of the act, but it's a pretty powerful and comprehensive act to look at regional planning and land use. I wish I could remember the name of it. And under the context of that, they actually have been doing some work on developing something like regional plans, and it's something we're monitoring and we've contributed to as the government of Canada to played some role in. So the results of that are going to start rolling out in the months to come, and we'll be looking carefully at has that process produced something that's useful, for example, to federal EA? It's an interesting question, so we're having an open mind on that. We haven't made any, as far as the agency goes and the Act, cumulative effects assessment is a part of our Act. There's a requirement to look at it. How well is it done? I can't really. How well is it done? Some people would say it's not been done well, and others would probably not strongly disagree with that. Others may say it's been done great. I'm not sure who those people are. But certainly, any tools that help us better fulfill the legislative responsibilities that we have are something we're willing to look at. So we're in the middle of trying to figure out where do we really direct some of our efforts at the agency in terms of pushing some of these forward-thinking next directions for federal EA, doing more work on climate change, doing more work on regional SEA. Certainly, those are all possibilities. And we're in the middle of trying to figure that out.
I have a question I'd like to ask Michael. You and your colleagues have gone through an heroic effort in preparing the environmental impact statement for the light-duty truck fuel economy standards and greenhouse gas emission standards. To what extent has all of that effort had an effect on the ultimate decision on what standards to promulgate?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, dovetails in with what Dean was just talking about too, and we have the same debate, as I alluded to just briefly, in the NEPA requirement for cumulative impact assessment, and there is quite a large debate going on within the American impact assessment community about that requirement. No matter how small, and individually minor as the regulation state, effect is still, important or could be significant or should be significant in a cumulative impact sense. And so one of the arguments for those who come out on the side of, well, it would be ridiculous to certainly do greenhouse gas emissions and call all the effects significant for all actions, or certainly smaller or even medium-sized ones, is, what bearing will it have on the decision-making? So with that EIS, as I showed you a little bit, here you have an action that's sort of on the other end of the scale, where it might in fact be, if not, again, the largest, one of the largest single federal actions in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions, and yet when you model those emissions out in terms of their effects and scale it down to things like CO2 concentrations and then the effects of climate or sea level rise and temperature and precipitation, it's barely measurable, particularly modeled way out. But having said that, certainly the agency themselves was taking the differences between the different alternatives very seriously. Certainly the commenters were, particularly from different NGO groups, and many of them used the analysis that was in the document, particularly when the draft environmental study came out, to say, hey, why are you only going from 29 miles per gallon to 34? Why don't you, go much higher to 45 or 50? Because, gee, look how much more greenhouse gas emissions you'd save, because it is a very large number. Even again, if you add it into the global climate model, it still ends up being very small. And so when we did the first EIS and in the last, the Bush administration, that was the example that I showed you, and then in the newer one, the standard went up pretty significantly. So, it didn't end up being between, I think there were 8 alternatives in the environmental impact statement. It certainly didn't end up being a factor in the sense of selecting them. But a lot of the way that our NEPA process works is not what actually happens to sort of influence a project's design and ultimate selection of an alternative in the study, but sort of the fact of it operating out there, and so that the way an action gets designed sort of from the beginning because of the influence. And I think at the end of the day, that's what a lot of the folks' points, and Dean mentioned earlier this sort of point, which I totally agree with, that the very good question that I think we all have to keep asking ourselves are these impact assessments, particularly for medium and smaller projects, the right place to do greenhouse gas emissions? And I think it gets at your point, Michael, of your question. For most projects, they're probably not going to have a direct bearing on that decision maker's ability to pick. And yet, by doing that analysis, it might in fact show and sort of educate to what, at the end of the day may be a much more important issue again, which is sort of the effects of of climate change onto the actions. And so I think a lot of it for our act is going to be the fact that it's sort of out there and people are now thinking about it, and it will influence in ways sometimes we won't see how projects actually get designed and proposed, as well as influence the decision when it happens, even if it's not explicit.
Terrific. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank our 3 panelists for a terrific presentation. Thank you.